Hello and greetings from Hyde Park in Chicago. My name is Sebastian Burka and I'm the Senior Associate Director at the Stigler Center. Today, we're delighted to host a conversation on China's new COVID strategy with Professors Chang-Tai Hsieh and Joan Kaufman, moderated by journalist Nian. This is the fifth installment in our flagship series on China's political economy, discussing with scholars and experts the country's changing political economy environment and the potential domestic and international implications. You can watch the videos of the previous events in the series on the Stigler Center YouTube channel and read a series recap on our pro-market publication. We also have a new episode of our Capitalism podcast on China featuring Professor Hsieh, so please check it out and subscribe for new content. Please also visit our website to learn more and register for upcoming events. We have one on business ethics coming up, and we'll soon be adding more on various political economy topics. The relevant links can be seen in the chat function at the bottom of your screens. Before we begin, please note we are on the record and we will also post this video on our YouTube channel later. If you have any questions for the speakers, you can submit them via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. And as usual, views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. And now, please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Chang-Tai Hsieh is the Phyllis and Erwin Winkelried Professor of Economics and PCL faculty scholar here at Chicago Booth. He conducts research on growth and development and has been a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Banks of San Francisco, New York, and Minneapolis, as well as the World Bank's Development Economics Group and the Economic Planning Agency in Japan, among others. Professor Hsieh is also the recipient of a Sloan Foundation Research Fellowship, the Sun Yifang Prize twice, and an elected member of Academia Sinica, among others. Joan Kaufman is the Senior Director for Academic Programs at Schwarzman Scholars, which is based at Tsinghua University in Beijing. She is also a lecturer in global health and social medicine at Harvard Medical School. Previously, she served as the Director of the Global Center for East Asia in Beijing and Associate Professor of Health Policy and Management at Columbia University, as well as Adjunct Professor of Global Health Policy at Tsinghua University. Dr. Kaufman has taught and written extensively on global health policy, emerging infectious diseases, civil society, and other topics with a focus on China. And our moderator today is Nian Liu. She's the Financial Times China tech researcher based in Beijing. She covers China's technology companies, regulation, as well as other topics. Previously, she reported on business, finance, and politics for Handelsblatt and the German news agency. Nian is also a former fellow of the Stigler Center's Journalists in Residence program. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to Nian. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here and to be back at a discussion at the Stigler Center. And thanks for everyone who's joining us today. We have a great panel lined up to talk about China's end of its 3-year-long zero COVID policy, which has certainly brought relief as well as uncertainties and chaos to both people in China and the international community. So here in China, I've been talking to a lot of people on ground in the past 2 months, and even if most of them welcome the end of the stringent zero COVID, they have complained and questioned about how sudden it has happened and how unprepared the whole system was. We know about the access status, the long lines in hospitals and funeral homes. On the other hand, most people, they're hopeful but still cautious about this year's economic reboot, and many worry about new variants and new waves of infections and deaths. I believe now after 2 months of the abrupt shift of policy, we have some clarity of events now, but still a lot of important questions to ask. So on today's agenda, I'm hoping that given Joan and Chang-Tai's background, we would be talking about the end of zero COVID and its implications from both a public health point of view and an economic and diplomatic point of view. We will have 25 minutes for Q&A in the end, so feel free to submit any questions at any time in the Q&A box. Okay, so without further ado, my first question would be, why did COVID-0 come to such an abrupt end after so much resources going into it? And seemingly without a lot of preparation. We know the protest in November is probably a very important reason, but what are the other internal and external pressures that has forced China to make that decision? Joan, if you want to start first.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks very much to the Stigler Center for inviting me to participate in this panel. And hello, everybody. You know, on the question of the abrupt end of the zero COVID policy, you know, I do think there were many factors that led into it. The biggest one, though, really was that, you know, the genie was already out of the bottle in a way. There were already 40,000 infections a day once Omicron started sort of gaining ground in China in November. And you know, it was impossible to keep up, to implement the zero COVID policy in that context. Omicron is, you know, extremely contagious, and it was doing precisely that in China, spreading very quickly. And China was already in the throes of planning for the end of zero COVID. You know, we saw in November the 20 measures which were introduced, which was sort of the beginning of the end. And you know, I know that China had been consulting with Hong Kong, many other people. So many people were calling for the end of zero COVID over such a concerted period of time, not only internally, you know, that culminated in the protests a couple of weeks before the end of the policy, but externally and internationally. There was so much pressure on China to end zero COVID. It reminds me a lot of the, you know, the end of the one-child policy, which was sort of too little, too late in 2013. For years, 20 plus years, the demographers were calling for the end of the one-child policy. And by the time it actually ended, it was really, you know, impossible to mitigate the consequences of, you know, of the 30 years of the one-child policy on the below replacement fertility and the trends that were underway. Similarly, with the end of zero COVID, keeping the population so immunologically naive for so long set the stage for what we saw happen in December, where, you know, by most estimates, or many estimates, 80% of the population you know, came down with COVID in a very short period of time. So I think, you know, I think there were many reasons, and the protests, of course, I think were like the coup de grace in terms of, you know, the really gelling the sentiment of the population, you know, against the, you know, against the sort of irrational lockdowns that were not really making any sense anymore. Plus the mandatory testing, which wasn't even working because there were so many cases, the batch testing that was going on of 10 samples per batch. There were so many infections that they meant nothing. Everybody was locked down if one person was positive. That, you know, it just had to happen in a way. There was no way to keep the lid on it anymore. But why it happened so dramatically, I think, you know, is a question we'll be asking, you know, looking at the history books to tell us. Hopefully, we'll find out, you know, at some point what actually was happening behind the scenes. And let me just say that, you know, it was the lifting of the zero COVID policy, but at the same time, it was implemented with the so-called 10 measures, which were not 100%, you know, getting rid of everything. It was calling for home quarantine and, you know, you know, different, it was not nothing, if you know what I mean. But I think what effectively we saw with the end of using the health app and the, you know, the end of the PCR testing requirements, and showing that the green code was, you know, pretty much lifting the lid on the entire zero COVID policy. So, and I think the way people behaved was not exactly, you know, let's go out and go to the, you know, go to a restaurant tonight. I think people were very cautious and very concerned, especially as people started getting infected. So that's my, you know, my brief, not so brief analysis of why and what happened.
Yeah, there were basically two types of people. I know one group is that they're so eager to just get affected first, so they're done with it, and the other group who's still kind of been hiding at home and trying to avoid it. Chang-Tai, if you have anything to add to that question.
Let me just say that. Let me just first say that I don't really know the answer to that question. It's a real mystery to me. It's a real because I guess let me just say a couple of things. One is that one can point to all the reasons for why COVID-0 had to end, but one could also make the same argument about in, say, when looking at, say, Shanghai this summer, and it didn't happen then, right? It didn't happen then. And then there are a couple of things which make me think that it may not be exactly, I'm going to say, a rational, what one would think of as a rational decision-making process for a couple of reasons. One is that, as was alluded to, it was done in such an abrupt way with what looks like zero preparation, with just absolutely none of the preparation that one would need. One can also point to similar, like for example, what is still present, which is the fact that the most effective vaccines are still not available in China, which I think goes against the argument that, well, that's something else that one could argue. Well, that is obviously the most sensible thing to do. That is, if you really are serious about ending COVID, then how can you really do it if you don't allow the most effective drugs? And I guess the other thing that I would point to is that it did not happen. That is, I think that the broader story that I see coming out in the last 2-3 months, that it's not just the end of COVID-0, but what we're seeing now is that it also looks like there might be an abrupt shift in foreign policy, and there also might be, and time will tell, there's also might be an abrupt shift in terms of economic policy, in terms of policy towards the tech firms, policies towards the real estate sector that has been like sort of, front and center of Chinese economic policy for the last 3 years. So lots of resources, lots of propaganda has gone into really all four of these things into foreign policy, in terms of COVID-0, in terms of policy towards the tech sector, in terms of policy towards the real estate sector, and they all but in the last 2 months we have seen an abrupt shift, and in terms of the measure. So I think that there's something deeper here. That's my guess. Or what exactly is the deeper thing? I can speculate on what that is, but the truth is that I don't really know. Let me just say one other thing, that I think there also might be something to this idea of that, like the way that the administrative apparatus works in China is that for most things, there's a lot of stuff that's left to the discretion of local governments. At least that's mostly the way that it works. But except for the things that are viewed as being really important priorities, and when things are viewed as really important priority, then it takes a very different form. It takes the form of what I'm going to call a Maoist campaign. We've seen it throughout. So the COVID-0 was one of them. It was a centrally directed Maoist campaign, and the previous time that I saw this was in the crackdown on the crackdown on pollution that took place maybe 5 or 7 years ago. And there it's basically, the way that these things work is that the whole party apparatus is brought in, and you have this rigid cry. And then all the local leaders are assessed based on, in the case of COVID-0, how many cases do you have? And then the thing I think about this, the way that these things are implemented, is that it's it's an administrative apparatus that once you do it that way, it's really hard to allow for any discretion, for any any discretion. And part of what I saw was also just the shift towards, like in November and December, when there was this shift towards, why don't you apply some discretion on how you do it? And then what I saw is that local governments just went all the way in the other way. And then once you did that, then it becomes very hard to bring that mechanism back. So that once you implement this I'm going to solve this Maoist campaign, it's either a 1 or 0 thing. It's either it's either 1 or 0 thing, and that's one interpretation or that's one answer to the question that you gave of why this abrupt change, and it might be just a consequence of the way that COVID-0 was implemented, and it was so. Admittedly, that's speculative, but let me just add by saying that I don't really know. I don't think anybody really knows except the certain people in the party. But it certainly does not look planned, like a planned, well thought out strategy to me. So.
Right, I think you're right. I think in Hebei province is probably a very obvious example. When the 20 measures first come out, the whole city just went completely open for 2 days without, like, they canceled all the testing and stuff. And then after 2 days, when people were criticizing how unprepared it was, it sort of like started implementing measures again. So it's like local governments kind of sometimes have no idea what to do when there's like a top-down central policy given them without a lot of like explanations and details.
No,
so I
think that's exactly right. I mean, I think so. Right. So then let me just add to that is that I think part of the explanation could be sort of this abrupt change was that local officials, in anticipation of another Maoist policy in November or December, they're trying to get ahead of it. They're trying to get ahead of it because now there's this uncertainty about what the next policy is going to be. And then they're anticipating it, and they think that the next policy is going to be let's try to be the very first at removing all these policies because it's the anticipation of what is going to be the next political campaign, and the guess is that the next political campaign is going to be who can be the very best in terms of opening up COVID-0. So let's try to, be the very best in terms of opening up to COVID-0. That's one possible interpretation, and that's consistent with some of the things I've seen with like the story that you just gave about that particular local government.
I just think it's important to highlight that, China is not this monolithic place, and that the local implementation of the, whatever as you said, Chang-Tai, the whatever the directive is, whatever the policy is subject to a lot of variation. And there was a lot of overkill with the implementation of the zero COVID policy, which led to so much complaint, and rightfully so, in Shanghai and other places because of the lockdown. So I think that was becoming to some degree uncontrollable, especially as Omicron was spreading, because the possibility of many lockdowns based on the rules of zero COVID, it would have been a total and complete chaotic mess in China. Not chaotic, but just pretty much everywhere was going to be locked down if under the rules of locking down a whole building if one case was found, that kind of thing. So I think that the fact that there was so much local variation and overkill really played in a lot to the demise in the end, with so much Omicron spreading.
Right, thank you, Joan and Chang-Tai. So my next question, I think, before we could talk about implications of the lift of zero COVID, is that from a public health point of view and based on your knowledge, are there going to be new waves of infections and deaths? Do you expect a lot of new changes in the future, or do you think even if there's new infections will be small waves, so it won't affect big policy changes in China?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm certainly not a virologist, but I am a public health person, and I do follow it pretty closely in China. Um, the China's chief epidemiologist at the CDC, who I know very well and I worked with very closely in my work on HIV/AIDS over the years, Wu Zunyo, had predicted earlier, before Chinese New Year, that there would be 3 waves in China. But most recently, just a few days ago, I think, basically said that about 80% of people in China were infected with COVID during December, and really doesn't see that there will be another big wave, certainly in the coming months, and certainly in the post-Chinese New Year period. Of course, I'm watching that very closely because I'm supposed to go in a few weeks. But I just think I trust him. He's good and he knows his stuff. So I'm optimistic that the worst is over. And I think in terms of new variants, that's a harder one to say. I think the virus itself kind of mutates to or adapts for more, has been adapting in the direction of more transmissibility, contagiousness versus its lethalness, right? And so I think if we continue to see variants in that direction, that's probably the direction we might see. But I'm really not sure. I think with so many people having gotten infected so recently, the susceptible population is much smaller, and they're still fairly naive immunologically for this particular virus. It's probably this variant that's going to spread. I'm not sure we're going to see a lot of new variants coming out of China, but I don't know for sure. I'm not a virologist, and I think it's a question more for a virologist. I think over the next period of time, it looks like it's going to be a fairly stable situation, I would say, since so many people were infected in such a short amount of time. And most recovered, of course. Like I think we've seen a lot of deaths in the over 80 and the elderly, as we have around the world. 70% of the deaths in the United States, which were much greater than we have seen in China, right? Were in the over 65s, and those are the more vulnerable. And especially in China, the elderly have a lot of underlying health conditions, non-communicable diseases that put them at greater risk, like diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, lung diseases related to pollution and smoking and everything else, and put them at greater risk and make them much more vulnerable to COVID. So I think what we're seeing is the older old, the over 80s in particular, be extremely hard hit. They were, I think one of the things I would really agree with Chang-Tai is just like, with a dramatic, there was so much that could have been done during the zero COVID policy to prepare China for opening up, including and especially the fully vaccinating the elderly, especially the older elderly. But they were reluctant. There was a lot of vaccine hesitancy. There wasn't a lot of congregate living. The focus of the vaccination campaigns was on the working population who were out in the community. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that. I think many of the elderly received like the first doses. I think the vaccination rates were probably fairly similar to the United States, but didn't get the boosters. I think only 40% of the elderly were boosted, and that's where we're seeing there's a lot of elderly in China because of the demographics. There are many, probably like 35 million people over 85, and 100 and I don't know, 20 or so million, or 13% of the population over 65. There's China's an aging population, and it's not a healthy aging population. So you're seeing a lot of deaths there, and I don't think we know the extent of that really at all. What's been reported, there was a New York Times article, just to say this, recently looking at the websites of the China Academy of Engineering and the National Academy of Sciences, and looking at the reported deaths in the 2 months before December, and then in the couple of months since. And it was like 10 times more people dying than in previously. So, I think that's an indicator that there's a lot more deaths in the elderly population than certainly have been reported. And we really won't know until there's a census or some kind of estimate of expected versus, expected mortality in that age group versus the actual that are going to show up in a census or an intercensal survey. So I'll stop there. Sorry.
Right. Thank you so much. You were talking about vaccines, and Chang-Tai also mentioned about vaccines. So my next question is that China is still sort of unwilling to import foreign mRNA vaccines and trying to stick to its own domestic make ones. I was wondering, what do you think are the reason behind it? Is sort of like a nationalist reason, and also on the other hand, China is like trying to sell and donate a lot of its own vaccines to other countries, especially the Belt and Road ones and those who are close with China, while the West, US, and Europe are trying to hold as many vaccines as they can. So how does it play in terms of like China's foreign policies? How does it shape China's image globally? And yeah, that would be my question for Joan next.
Okay, for me, well, okay, I would just say that I think China's gotten really a lot of bad press about its vaccine, which is really it's not a bad vaccine, it's like fairly effective, especially with 3 doses. And I think while there's so much demonization of China in the press, and I'm sure everyone's as aware of it as I am, that China can do no good really. But I think if you look at what they've done with the vaccine diplomacy and making their vaccine available for sale mostly around the world, while we were hoarding the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines in the global north, I think it's impressive and it deserves to be commended. Despite all the missteps with China, the genome was published very quickly after the virus was identified in January of 2020, and that was the basis for every vaccine that has been manufactured, especially the mRNAs. So, I think it's a more complicated story about those vaccines, those 2 vaccines, the mRNAs. I think it's at least partly the unwillingness of Moderna and Pfizer to make their technology available, their patented technology available, for manufacturing in China, for fear of intellectual property right issues. And, I think frankly, I don't think we learned enough from the AIDS pandemic where, if these life-saving technologies exist, they should be made available around the world, not, with an eye towards protecting the patents, but as a life-saving technology for the people who need it. But I think there's been unwillingness on both sides to make those vaccines available and for China to actually create its own mRNA vaccine as well. So I do think back to the question of vaccine diplomacy, though, I think, they have made their vaccine available to many countries in the world. It is a less effective vaccine, and most of those countries have started to import the mRNAs now that they are available and boosting their own campaigns. But it's not an ineffective vaccine, and they made it available when others were not. So, I think that China should be congratulated for that, actually, for stepping up and making something available, when nothing else was really, getting to the global south, that's for sure.
Right. Chang-Tai, do you have anything to add, especially when you mentioned that there's also a shift in China's foreign policy? How do you think it's going to play out in the future?
Yeah, I don't think this is really much to do with the foreign policy. Let me just say, your question, I think, is one, it is the thing that puzzles me the most. It's the thing so let me just say that it's not, very early on, Pfizer had a deal with a large Chinese pharmaceutical company to manufacture the Pfizer vaccine in China. and it just never got approved. I mean, it was never got approved. I mean, I guess the obvious answer for why it's never been approved, it's because of this political campaign to show the superiority of Chinese technology. That's the only argument that makes sense. But then it seems like a really hollow argument, given the facts that we know now about the relative effectiveness of the two types of vaccines. So I mean, it's obviously not the case that the Chinese vaccine is completely ineffective. That's obviously not the case. But I mean, this would have gone so much better if the dosages of the Chinese vaccine had been supplemented with some of the mRNA vaccines, and it really. I mean, I guess there's it's so. Let me just say, it's a thing that really puzzles me the most, and that in terms of the narrative that people are telling, that the shift that we have seen is that it was that all these things were inevitable, and that now they're thinking more, that they are thinking more clearly, or whatever was the reason behind the shift. And then if all of that is true, then why is it that they're not using the most effective vaccines? I mean, it was obviously true that in 2021 the vaccines were being hoarded by the Western countries, but now that's not the case anymore. Now there's a surplus. I mean, there's a surplus, so that doesn't hold anymore. So it's a real puzzle to me. I mean, it's a real, and I don't. I mean, I don't completely understand it, other than just wanting to adhere to this political campaign. But even that doesn't make much sense to me. So I don't know. I don't know. I think the shift in foreign policy, I think, is due to something else. I mean, that's something else. That's something else completely. I don't think it has anything to do with COVID or the end of COVID zero. I think it's just the fear that in the last few years the world has turned against China and is viewed as just as something that will harm China in the long run, and then the views that something's got to be done about it. But again, the question is, how much of that is real, and how how far is that going to go? And I don't think we know the answer to that yet.
Right, I guess so. The good news we've heard from Joan today is that hopefully there will be no big waves or new deaths in the near-term future. So my next question would be, if there's no new waves, do you expect a sharp uptick for economic growth soon, or a slow pickup that would happen in later this year? And why is that?
Here's the thing, right? I mean, there's I would separate that into two parts. One is what's going to happen in the short run, and what's going to happen in the medium to long run. In the short run, I mean, I expect China to go through COVID. I mean, and to go through COVID, and then the question is whether it goes through it with a lot of loss of with a lot of loss of life, or with a relatively small loss of life. I don't think we know that yet. But at some point, it's going to end, right? At some point, it's going to end, and all the normal consumer behavior is going to come back to life. So that I think is the short run, the answer in the short run. then the question is well, after that happens, what happens 5 years out, 5 years out, and there I don't think we know. I don't think we know because it depends on what the economic policies are. I mean, and I just don't think we know, um, because part of, I think, what is so difficult about China today is that it is such a black box, right? It is such a black box about what is driving the decision-making process. It is such a black box about what the intentions actually are, what the intentions, so that it's almost like we're back to the world of the 1950s or the 1960s in the Soviet Union, where we are making guesses based on who is standing next to who in the annual public displays in the Kremlin. So I guess the answer is basically, I don't really know what economic policy is going to be in 5 years. I mean, I don't really know. So if I knew the answer to that question, then I can say, right? I can say, but in terms of like the short run, I think it's clear that there will be a continued short run effect of COVID on consumer behavior, but I expect that to end. I mean, I expect that to end at some point, and then you get into sort of the I'm going to say the bigger, in my mind, the bigger questions, which is what is going to happen to China's the way that the way that the Communist Party interacts and how it thinks about the private sector. What is going to happen to, what is going to be its view towards the real estate sector and towards the financial sector, and what is going to be sort of the nature of the interaction of China with the rest of the world. Our say is, like, the biggest thing in terms of China's interaction with the world is what happened last October in terms of the export ban that the U.S. put in place on the Chinese semiconductor industry, and the question is whether that is going to spread to more and more sectors, and I anticipate that it will, right? And so how is that all going to play out? I just don't think we know. So not a great answer, but I think that's the truth.
Right. So, I mean, Liu He also promised a more open market and bold reforms at the Davos last month, but we don't really know how it turned out.
Yeah,
It's
and
not turned out in the end.
yeah. Thing is, Liu He is out of the Central Committee, so
Right, that's the problem.
So really, what he says is not that relevant. It's really who is going to replace him, and I don't think we know that either, right?
Right.
And let me just go on record and say that I don't want to say there won't, COVID's still with us, right? It's with us globally. There are likely to be new waves everywhere. If you look back at the 1918 flu epidemic, it was, like a 3 to 5, it was like a 4 or 5 year event or something. And COVID certainly hasn't gone away. So will there be future waves in China? Probably. How severe will they be? It's hard to say. But, I don't think China's done with COVID. I just think that they're on a new, they're like the rest of the world, figuring out how to live with the virus and deal with the waves. And, the likelihood that COVID's going to be with us forever in some form or another. So.
Right. Then, Joan, since you're on it, the next question I want to ask is like how geopolitics is playing into the representations and realities of China's COVID situation. I mean, there are still talks about the lab theory in China. There are still testing requirements from some countries for Chinese citizens, and there are some fears of like new variants emerging from China. So I want, if you have any opinions on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just tie it back to, this negative representation or demonizing of China. It just, it just extends into all of this, I would say. It's hard to come back from, the anti-China sentiment of the previous political administration in the United States calling, the Kung flu and all those things. And I think it's contributed also to, a lot of anti-China feeling in general, and the kind of groupthink on negative views towards China. I mean, some of it, like, after this weekend, especially, you can see where some of that's coming from, but across the board negativity toward China, I think, it has to really be balanced by the science. I think many of the scientists, most of the scientists, for example, have dismissed the lab theory, the lab leak theory. There was actually a recent article in Science magazine that looked at, I think they looked at 2,000 animals, and 18 of which are eaten as delicacies in China and sold in the live animal markets. And they identified 102 viruses, 21 of them at high risk for, human transmission, some of which had never been identified before. And I think the feeling in the scientific community is that it's so likely, all the evidence points towards a spillover event of, from, live animals to, to humans. And that, I think we don't know the details of that. We haven't identified the actual animal and the actual source of the infection, but the predominance of, opinion is that. And despite that, this lab leak theory lives on, as a plausible explanation for how COVID began. So, I think we'll see more emerging infectious diseases in the future. And, there's not going to be a lab to point your finger at, for engineering. And I just think that just represents the negativity, towards, in the geopolitical space, that is, just the lens through which so many people are looking at China these days, and the COVID situation. I mean, honestly, in the big picture of things, prior to December, there were like 5,000 deaths in China compared to 1 million in the United States. And in the larger scheme of things, with the COVID pandemic, that's the ultimate measure, right, of how many people died from COVID. I think the zero COVID policy was an okay policy for a long time. China lived a fairly open existence when it was manageable to do zero COVID for several years. Then it became completely untenable at a certain point, and the rest of the world moved on. But I think China also deserves some credit, and the Chinese population, I think, give their government a lot of credit for having, controlled the epidemic in the early phase, and prevented so many avoidable deaths. So, I think when you look at it through different lens, it's important to take a more balanced view. Let me put it that way. I mean, certainly China deserves a lot of criticism for a lot of dimensions of the zero COVID policy, the lockdowns, and many other parts of it. But it's, it wasn't all bad, right? And it wasn't all without popular support, I would say, in the country.
Let
Right,
me just let me just add to that, is that I think that, I mean, there certainly are people that are taking joy in China's current situation with COVID. And I think that is just really unfortunate. That's just and I also think that on balance, the China's approach towards COVID, over that I sort of take the totality, when I compare it in the totality over the last 2 years, when I compare to what the policy in the US has been, what the policy in, like, pick a country, Mexico, Brazil. It's not it. That there are parts of it that you could quibble with, but in totality, I don't think it's been that. I don't think it's been great. I don't think it's been terrible. But it's like any other country. It's like any other country. There are things that you do that are better. There are things that you do are terrible. So, and I think that I'll also just say that in terms of sort of your question, let me put it this way. That is, would the views about China in Washington be different if COVID had not happened? And I would stick my neck out and I would say no. I think that COVID has very little to do, very little to do. That is, if Wuhan had not happened and none of this had happened, I mean, obviously that's not we don't get to see that counterfactual, but my guess is no. Is no, that I think it's something deeper. It's something sort of what we see, sort of it's really amazing to me to watch the political consensus in Washington that there's only one thing that all sides of the political spectrum in the U.S. agree on now, and it's about China. In Washington they agree on nothing else, but on China they do, and it's a real problem. I mean, it's a real issue. I mean, we can talk about what is driving that, but I do fear that it's almost become like this Gordian knot that I think is just really hard to untie. And it's spilling over into economic policy. It's spilling over into lots of things. And that, in terms of, like, you're going to ask this question, but in terms of the main danger to the world, or the main danger to the world in the next 10 or 20 years, it's really this conflict, right, between the US and China. I think that's the biggest barrier to global prosperity.
Yeah, I agree.
So yeah, with all these anti-China sentiment you mentioned, and the sort of like very tight relationship between US and China, the sanctions, the bans, and an overall very slow global economic growth, I think I want to ask that, what do you think it means for China's economic reboot this year, especially like China relies a lot on exports. There's been they've been trying to shift the policy to sort of rely the GDP more on consumption and sort of turn back to the domestic property market. But how do you think it's going to play out?
This year, I don't think it's going to have much of an effect, because that I think really the thing I worry about is what is the world going to look like? What is China going to look like in 10 years? What is the US going to look like in 10 years? I mean, that really is the thing. It's like, with all these like just think about specifically about semiconductors right now. Sort of these export bans don't have any effect on the technology currently in the Chinese semiconductor company. It's going to have a big effect in terms of what they are capable of doing 5 years from now, right? If you saw today, the U.S. government announced that they're going to also put in place bans on the use of dollar-denominated transactions for, I don't know whether you saw that news today. So they're also using they're beginning to use the U.S.'s control over the financial system to go after certain Chinese firms. Right? So I think that the risk. I think that the risk to global growth in the next 5 or 10 years, I think, are really serious.
Right, Joan, if you have anything to add on, like, how is the overall anti-China sentiment and slow global recovery going to impact China, and how especially China going to do in the public health sector?
Well, I think, China has a lot of challenges right now, not the least of which are its own demographics, as the population is declining, and there's a decline in new labor force entrants. It pushes China to need to kind of technologically innovate, and there are a lot of tensions there. I'm not an economist, but I do think China's facing a lot of challenges right now coming out of this COVID period. and the geopolitical tensions don't make it easy, that's for sure. And in some ways, I don't think China is always helping itself. There's been a real toning down of this kind of wolf warrior diplomacy, or the aggressive, but it's China's much more muscular in the global space these days, and with I think with a lot of the geopolitical tensions happening in the world right now, people are getting put into camps, and I think it's just going to be it's a challenging period of time. I really don't know uh, how I'm a fan of China's, and I've worked in China for my whole career, and think that I think China will pull the rabbit out of the hat and surprise us all, as it always does, and thrive and be a come back from many of the challenges that it's facing right now. But it's hard to see that future. I've lived in an environment of engagement, and where there's much less engagement right now than there has been over many years. And I think the more we separate, the less interaction there is on a daily basis in the fields of public health and economics and others, the less back and forth and scholarly communication and diplomatic communication, the easier it is to get to increase the divide and not narrow the divide. So I worry about that. I think the combination of COVID and the geopolitical tensions, the anti-China sentiments here in this country, and increasing globally, have made it difficult to get back to a place where we're working together to solve the kinds of global problems we need to be working together to solve. So that's just a personal view, but very much influenced by my own long career of engagement with China.
Right. It obviously seems like China has realized how its relationship with the West and the rest of the world has been damaged, and how it can't rely on the euro export growth method. So I want to ask Chang-Tai, what do you think about China's shift into a more consumption-based growth method? Because in the past 3 years, I think consumption patterns has changed a lot. There's like China's household savings has been hit a record high of 2.6 trillion US dollars. And a lot of people I talk to are talking about how they think the future is so unstable and uncontrollable, and they would like to save more money and spend less. So I wonder how it's going to affect China's economic growth in the future.
I mean, I don't really think that I don't really think that is the real issue. And let me just point out, just say that let me just say that this notion about consumption-based growth versus investment led growth, that idea has really never made a whole lot of sense to me. If I think about sort of like, if you stop back and you ask the big picture question, which is, what was it that changed about China between 1978 and now? Right? There's no question that China is a very different place now than where it was in 1978. Right? And it's not really about a shift from investment to consumption, or the other way, or the other way around. Right? It's that it fundamentally is about, I'm going to say, it's really fundamentally about what were the changes in two things: in the capabilities of Chinese firms, what they're capable of doing, and also related to that is the allocation of resources between different types of firms. That really, I think, is is the like and if I think about like what is it that fundamentally changed about China, it's really these two things, right? And if I think about sort of the fundamental challenge about China, that it is about um, how are firms going to be able to grow? Where, are they going to have the incentives in order to innovate? Are they going to be able to get access to the technologies that are going to allow them to move to the next level? Are they going to be able to get access to the resources that they need to be able to grow? That really, I think, is really the more fundamental question in my mind. And also, when you look at any period in the last 50 years, the thing that has changed is sort of the answer, is the answer to these questions. Right? Or if you look back to say the last 3 to 5 years, like in terms of the main economic event in the last 5 years, it was. I mean, you would know this well, Nian, but like starting in 2008, like the big event was sort of the beginning of the financial deleveraging. What started in 2008 was the crackdown on the big financial conglomerates, the Anbang Group, the Wanda Group, and on and on and on and on. In 2009, they started to roll out the financial deleveraging campaign, and then it led to what happened to Evergrande when sort of their sources of financing dried up. And then starting in 2020, sort of the beginning of the crackdown on the tech firms. And that's sort of the genesis of the sort of the rise in youth unemployment. And I mean, we can talk about what were the reasons behind it. But that really is, I think, is really the fundamental thing in my mind. And then the question is and then starting I guess starting at roughly the same time was sort of the beginning of this campaign by the US, starting with Huawei to curb or to crack down on or to prevent the most productive Chinese firms from growing because for some reason they were viewed as a threat to American national security. And then how all of this is going to play out, I think that really is the question.
Right, you certainly raised a lot of important questions, and I think it's like such huge questions, and we will need more time to see how things turn out in the future. So I think we need time to take some questions from the audience now. From Joan, how would you measure the damage of the 3-year zero COVID policy to China? I think that's a very big question, but if you could both answer from like your background point of view. Joan, if you want to go first.
Yeah, well, I do think that the closed borders over 3 years in the context of the growing geopolitical tensions, it's really been damaging in terms of, exacerbating, I would say, the geopolitical tensions. I think it's just the inability, the business community, for example, has always been a great, a kind of, I don't want to say counterbalance, but important force for, how we, engage with China diplomatically in many ways. And I feel that, that just the closing down of so much over the last 3 years has created an environment where that kind of day-to-day relationships that have been so much the substance of the US-China relationship over time, and the rest of the world, have really suffered greatly. So I just see China's been much more cut off from the world and become much more insular, and with that more nationalistic to some degree as well. And it's only kind of exacerbated the geopolitical tensions. I think Chang-Tai can talk about how the impact economically, I can't really speak to that. I just, I think that there's been a certain, insularity in China as well by being so cut off over the last 3 years. That's going to be hard. This will have play out and has been playing out in a number of different ways. I think that's pretty much all I'll say about that.
I guess the quick answer to your question, I actually do think that like for the first year and a half, the COVID zero policy, I think was in terms of, I think helped China economically. Uh, um, I think it's only really been like starting in the spring of 2022 when you start to see these variants, these other variants, that's when you start to see, well, that's when COVID zero no longer worked, right? That's when COVID zero, and then you start to get the worst of both worlds. That is, the COVID zero no longer work, but you're still implementing the lockdown, and you're doing it with greater and greater intensity to try to stop the variants, and it doesn't work. And it's only really then that I think you start to see the major economic damage strictly from COVID zero. So I think that it's, for the most part, I think that like the COVID zero has been like on net, I think a positive for China's in terms of the question they asked about the Chinese for China's economy. Now, I think that Joan is absolutely right that in terms of the engagement with China, I guess I would love to know how the Schwarzman program has been able to keep going in the last 2 years. I can't, because like the kind of things that I saw the Schwarzman people doing, I thought were just absolutely like in 2018 or 2019, I see them, so part of their program that I saw was that they had this module where they had to go out and they had to engage with local government officials, and they had to spend. I mean, that's one of the things I thought was just fabulous about what they, so they actually had gained this granular understanding of how things. I can't imagine that something like that is possible now. Just even aside COVID zero, that it's also just politics in China. I can't. I mean, you can tell me when I'm wrong, but I just,
yeah, you're wrong. We're still doing it, but of course we were affected like everybody else. But we have our scholars there, as we did last year, much more limited in their ability to travel. But certainly we're.
But it's not just travel. There's also this fierce, just anti-Americanism, or just fear.
Well, we're a global cohort, right?
Okay.
We're not just American. So 20% Chinese, 40% global, 40% US. But we're still up and operational, and I'm happy to say I think that that other programs as well. I think that it's the what you say, I think reflects a kind of an attitude which I don't think completely dovetails with reality on the ground. We're just business as usual for the most part with the program. Obviously limited by the ability to move around because of COVID in China, but our scholars are there, and traveling and able to go out and do the deep dives and do all those other things. So yeah.
Right. The next question I want to take from the audience is also a question I want to ask myself. Given the success of white paper protests, do you think protests in mainland China will be a constant theme that could shift Beijing's policy in the future, or it would be only a one-time thing? Especially there's been protesting in Wuhan yesterday and the day before yesterday about medical insurance policy changes, and it seems like has also affected local government changing their policy. Do you think this thing is going to work out more often in China in the future?
Chang-Tai,
Yeah.
My answer is absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, let me just add more context. That it's not that protests are rare in China. That protests happen all the time. They happen all the time when workers don't get paid, when a local government official expropriates some land and people are not happy about it. People protest whenever there's a factory that pollutes their water or pollutes their. So that happens all the time. I mean, it happens all all the time. What was really unusual about the white paper protests was how widespread they were. That they were widespread geographically, widespread across social classes, and I think that it just took a lot to make that happen. It took a lot to I mean just and I just and also just how much it took to get to that point of the protest also tells me that it's going to be extraordinarily rare for that to ever happen again. So I don't. Yeah, so I certainly I do not expect that to happen again unless there's another like this really this something that cuts across and that hurts as much as COVID zero did by September, October of 2022, and I don't expect that to happen.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the likelihood of that becoming a regular thing that changes policy seems pretty slim to me, in the Chinese political system as we know it. But on the other hand, it did obviously let off steam. And, there are quite a lot of local protests around China all over the, for many issues, very local, that I do think let off some steam. And I don't know that they necessarily lead to a lot of change, but I don't see this becoming a mechanism of, policy change in China as a major vehicle. Except, I think if there's another crazy something that cuts across, as John, as Chang-Tai was saying, cuts across in such a significant way, such an irrational, situation.
And let me just say that, I mean, the way I think about the Communist Party is that this really, I think, is one of their deepest fears. And I just think that they're going to do everything they can to make sure that this never, ever happens again.
Right. I thank you both. I think we may have question for one more question from Peter Liu. He asked if there's any evidence to support alternative timing would be better for China to lift its zero COVID policy. I think you can both answer from like a public health and economic point of view.
Yeah.
Is there a better timing?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's an interesting question. I don't think, we don't have the playbook on COVID, right? We haven't from the start, and I think it's important to recognize that when this thing hit the scene in January of 2020, had it happened anywhere in the world, who would have been able to predict what had happened, what was going to happen and how it was going to evolve? So, I do think the proof will be in the pudding, so to speak. Like, we'll see what would happen over the next 6 months. But, I think as you said earlier, Nian, people have really moved on. It's like moved on from COVID. And is COVID really over? I really don't know. I mean, certainly, I think once we realize how many people died in December, there may have been a different playbook, a more gradual opening over time with a huge effort to vaccinate, with effective vaccines, the elderly, the people who I think probably did die in larger numbers, right? Maybe many of those deaths could have been averted with a different playbook. I don't think it's a $60 million question. What's the right thing to do versus the wrong thing to do in this pandemic? I think we'll only know maybe historically with 2020 hindsight. So that's my take on that.
Yeah. So Nian, that is way beyond anything I know, so I will pass.
Right. I think we're running out of time as well. Thank you, Joan and Chang-Tai, for this fascinating discussion and for your great insights. Also, thank you to Stigler Center and the University of Chicago. I hope you all have enjoyed the webinar as much as I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Nian, for fabulous moderation. And thank you, Chang-Tai, for your great comments.
Thanks.
Pleasure being on the panel with you both.
Pleasure.
Okay.